Welcome everybody. Peter Carson here, and it's Tuesday, February 9th. We're doing a webinar on joining your ERP and Microsoft Teams at the hip. So let me dive right into it. So quick introductions for those of you that haven't been on a webinar with me before. My name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager, also an Office Apps and Services Microsoft MVP. My contact details are up on here, so feel free to reach out. We're recording the session and we're going to make the deck available afterwards, so you can always grab the details from there. What I'm going to do now, though, is I'm just going to turn my camera off, just so you got a little more screen real estate. So bear with me a sec here. There we go. Okay, so a little background on who Extranet User Manager is. We're the products side of Envision IT, so kind of two companies in one, and it's a business that we've been playing in for quite some time, over 10 years now, and eventually productized about 6-7 years ago the ability to create a digital community outside of your organization and to manage those users, and that's really what it's about. And the Teams provisioning that we're going to speak about here is kind of grown out of that work as well, to say, hey, looking for a standardized way to provision new Teams and SharePoint sites and such. How do we productize that? We did a slightly different path with the Teams provisioning, though. We actually decided to go the open source path. So everything that I'm going to be presenting here, we publish out in our GitHub repository, and it's freely available in full source format through there. We do, of course, provide consulting services around that in terms of customizations and implementations around that. Lots of customers around the world. I'm going to go fairly quickly through that side of it and just jump right into the agenda. So we've already done the intros. We're going to do some background more specific to the Teams provisioning side of it. And then I'm actually going to use Envision IT as a consulting company. What have we done? How do we manage Teams internally ourselves? And actually going to share our live Teams as part of that and kind of walk you through decisions that we've made, why we've made those decisions, and how that helps keep us organized. We'll get into templating and provisioning coming out of that. And then we've got a number of client scenarios that we're going to walk you through as part of that. I forgot to update the agenda. We're going to touch on the external sharing piece kind of up here underneath the Envision IT scenario. Now we've got the chat open. We've got staff online as well with the session. So if you've got questions as we're going, feel free to post them in there. Folks on our team will be answering that. And if there's an appropriate question or time, feel free to interrupt me and we'll dive into that during the session itself. There is about a 20-second lag between me speaking and you hearing just through the Teams live event because it's buffering it as it streams it out onto the internet. So it's sometimes hard to get a live dialogue back and forth through there, but we'll do our best from that point of view. I'm going to pause on this one for a second here. You can either go to the chat. I think Logan is, or the Q&A, Logan has published out the link here that we have for the bit.ly. But what you can also do is just grab your phone and go to your camera app. You don't need to actually take a picture of this screen. Just hold your camera app open on the QR code and you should get a prompt at the top, either on iOS or Android, saying, hey, do you want to open this page? And it takes you to a Microsoft Forms survey. Don't worry, it's not a phishing attack. It's a very simple form to fill out and gather a little bit of information. We like to do these as part of our webinars, get a sense of the audience, what sort of background they have coming in and such from there. I'll pause partway through or towards the end and we'll share the results of that poll just to show you what comes out of that. The nice thing of doing it on your phone is you can answer the 4 or 5 questions that we've got in there easily while you keep the main session going through here. Okay. So let's start with the business challenge. What brought us here today? What was the thing that we were trying to fix? And we're all in this COVID boat together globally. Remote working has just exploded, and with that, there's been an explosion of Teams adoption, Zoom, you name it, from a remote working platform point of view. Usage obviously has gone through the roof as people, for the most part, in the knowledge industry at least, are working remotely. And a lot of this has been unplanned. I mean, everybody kind of got thrown into it last March and did the best they could to manage that. And we're getting to the point now that, hey, this still isn't done. Yes, there's vaccines. Things are going to be going back, but even the new normal post-COVID, I think we're probably going to be seeing a change in the workforce from a remote work point of view. I'm not saying that the office is dead. I mean, we still got our lease on our office space. We're planning on getting back in there. Staff are looking forward to safely being able to work together. but I don't think they're going to be in there 100% of the time. So this remote world is probably here to stay. It's kind of accelerated that transition that was happening pre-COVID, anyways, through there. So how do we plan better for that? And self-service is really important. People don't want barriers in place. People don't like rules. Don't force me to work in a certain way. So how do we mitigate that and manage that? That's what this session's about. So one of the things to realize when you create a Microsoft team, you don't actually just get a team. You get what's called a Microsoft 365 group under the hood of that, and that includes a SharePoint Modern Team Site, a OneNote notebook. It may include a planner plan, a stream group. So there's a lot of artifacts that get created as part of that you need to be aware of. And how do you manage that? There's different ways you can apply some governance around that. Excuse me. I mentioned we have an open source solution, so I've got a link there that you can use to jump over and have a look at that. There's a bunch of documentation, white papers and such on that. There's a number of commercial solutions as well. Our favorite in the commercial world is Orchestra. It's a new startup out of Vancouver, BC. Michael Pizarik's a fellow I've known for many years through the Microsoft MVP community. His team's done an awesome job of creating a really robust and from a user experience point of view, a really nice solution around not just provisioning and the request process, but how do you template that and build it out appropriately from that. So I'd encourage you to look at both of those options as part of that. So basically the solution that we're looking for here is some sort of simple self-service request form. People should be able to request a new team, and you may or may not want approvals on that. That may depend on who the requester is, what's the type of site that they're requesting. Is there certain site features like external sharing that they'd like turned on? That may require a difference in terms of whether it just automatically gets provisioned or whether somebody needs to sign off on that from that point of view. And then the really important thing for me is to provide some sort of templates. If everybody gets a blank team with a blank SharePoint site, and you've got hundreds of projects in your organization that are spun up that way, starting with a blank page and different people running them, you can guarantee they're not going to look the same. They're all going to be all over the map. So the templates aren't about forcing people to work a certain way. It's about saying, what, let's not start with a blank slate. Let's start with a suggested, and people are going to be much more consistent from that point of view. It's actually easier to follow a pattern that's provided for you rather than going off on your own from that perspective. And we're not saying you block that. I mean, if there's a reason somebody wants to go off on their own, fine, embrace that, allow that. But odds are, people are going to stick within that box that you've provided, just because it's easier to somebody's already thought about those decisions of how to organize things. Why don't I just use those? And you get consistency as a result from that. So it's kind of the carrot versus the stick, saying, what, we're not going to come down on people if they don't follow the pattern, but we're going to make it easy to allow them to follow the pattern. I find that a much softer sell, and from a change management point of view, tends to be better adopted, a lot less pushback from that point of view. So this is the Orchestra. I'm going to take you through a live demo on our open source side of things as well. As I mentioned, user experience is really rich on the Orchestra. This is integrated right into Microsoft Teams. So I've got an Orchestra app pinned on the left-hand side here. And I've got a number of features here. I can look at my requests and say, hey, I'd like to request a new workspace, which might be a team. It might just be a team site or a communication site, project workspace template. And you can define these workspaces and what goes into them, how the tabs get set up in Teams, how the SharePoint site gets configured, what starting documents are there, what tabs are in OneNote, what buckets are in Planner, all those elements that I talked about that get created as part of that request for a team, get provisioned out as part of this solution through there. So that's sort of the first challenge, to provide self-service through that. But what about bringing that into a bigger business process? Often creating a team or a channel is not the first thing that happens in your organization. It's not where things start. So teams may not be that system of record, and you really need to think about, what does a team and a channel represent for your organization? That's a really important question, and it's often not an easy question to answer. You have to think about, well, if a team represents this in my organization, how many of those are there, and how many teams is any one person going to belong to? Because you don't want to overwhelm people and have hundreds or thousands of teams that people belong to. It just becomes too much for them. Same thing with channels. If you get too granular and you end up with hundreds of channels in one team, that's also onerous. Teams will hide things and help to tidy that up for you, but does become difficult to manage from that point of view. And then lastly, how do you integrate that with your enterprise resource planning, your customer relationship management, your line of business system? You know, if you've got an existing business process, can this actually become part of that? And that's really where we're going to spend a lot of the focus here today. But what I want to do first is kind of walk you through those decisions that we've made with Envision IT. So as I mentioned, Envision IT is the parent company of Extranet User Manager. We're a Microsoft Gold partner. We've been in business for 20 plus years. We've literally got hundreds of clients and thousands of projects over that time frame. Now, we haven't created a team for every one of those clients, but the active ones, yeah, we're up into the, you know, I think less than 100, but certainly more than 50 teams as part of that. And projects per client averaging around 4. You know, some of our more active clients, we don't have all 50 historical projects in there, but we've certainly got a larger number of channels as part of that. And from a line of business, you know, how do we run our business? Obviously, Microsoft 365 is a big part of it. We're a Microsoft partner. We want to, you know, to use Microsoft's term, eat our own dog food and consume what we're building here. We also use Dynamics 365 CRM as part of our engagement model. So we track all of our accounts and contacts and leads. So when you registered for this webinar, you're recorded in our CRM with that activity through there. We're not a big company. We're only 18 people. So for us, QuickBooks works well. We use the online accounting for that. And like many professional services consulting, you know, software development companies, years ago, we built our own time tracking and project management software that's just kind of evolved and become part of that ecosystem as well. You know, we've transitioned to be fully in the cloud. So all of our solutions, including our in-house, you know, run in Microsoft 365 or in Azure or SaaS services. We kind of like that model, and that's working well for us. So, you know, to come back to the questions that I was phrasing before, you know, what did we decide? And we decided, you know what, let's create a team for every client. And within those teams, let's create a channel for every project. It helps to keep us organized from that point of view. If we have conversations around a particular client and a particular project for that client, we know where to look because those channel conversations are happening in teams. We have documents related to those projects and those clients. They're in the exact same place under the Files tab, and I'll show you as I walk through what that looks like. Now, one of the other important questions is around privacy, and I don't mean from a information protection point of view. I mean from a, you know, what's your style of organization? Do you run a very public internally organization or a very private one? For us, we run a very public one, so we don't have any division of information. You know, if you work for Envision IT, you see almost everything that's in our teams. Yes, there's a management team and an HR team that has some private confidential information in it, but for the most part, everything's available for everybody. So any client, any project, you know, all of our marketing, development, consulting teams, they're all available to the entire organization. That makes things a lot simpler for us. I mean, some of the examples that we're going to go through with clients, that's not the case where they do need to have privacy. They may have certain groups within their organization that can't see what other groups are doing for their clients. For example, there's privacy issues, there's division of responsibility. You know, if somebody's playing an audit role and somebody's playing a delivery role, you know, those need to be separated out. So as you get into bigger organizations, that can become more of a challenge. But certainly for us, we kept it simple, and that makes a lot of our questions much easier from that point of view. The next two are important ones too. You know, are you going to bring external users into your teams themselves? And you would think that we would say yes, because we're bleeding edge and we like to do the new and interesting things. The challenge I find is that Microsoft Teams today for Microsoft, and this is something that, you know, lots of people have been yelling at Microsoft for a long time, actually doesn't work that great for external users. Yes, you can do it, you can invite them in, but they need to make a conscious decision to kind of almost sign out of their tenant and sign into the tenant you've invited them into to see the messages and interact there. And then they lose visibility with what's happening in their home tenant until they switch back there. So you tend to miss a lot of messages. You can manage it. You can set up Chrome or Edge profiles and have multiple teams signed in at the same time and different profiles and manage it that way. It's a little techy, and the average user could find that a little overwhelming. So we find that doesn't tend to work well from that point of view. So we don't generally invite external users in. There are some exceptions to that. But we do generally invite users into SharePoint. We want to share the documents. We want to be able to co-author and collaborate and share those with our clients. So we're big on that side of it. So that's kind of how we've structured our site up. So I'm going to show you in diagram form, and then I'm going to dive into the actual Teams and SharePoint and Microsoft 365 world to kind of reinforce these ideas. So if we start sort of top leftish here, we've got a team that represents a client, and Teams has concepts of channels underneath it. So you're always going to have a general channel, and then you can create additional ones from there. So we as an organization say, okay, we're going to create channels like Project 1 and Project 2 underneath that client team. Now that's going to automatically create folders in SharePoint for those channels, for the files related to that to go into. So we'll have a general, a Project 1 and a Project 2 folder in our shared documents in the client site that got created as part of that team as well. Now, anytime you create a SharePoint team site, which happens when you create a team, you also get a OneNote in that SharePoint site. And this doesn't happen automatically, but what we do is we create what are called sections in OneNote to match those channels. So we've got jot notes that we want to keep, not from a conversation point of view, but from a record keeping point of view. We can keep in those sections. So if we've got meeting minutes or project notes and things like that, we're a huge fan of OneNote, and these OneNotes get shared by all members of the team through there. In fact, if we have external users coming into the client site, we can optionally allow them to come in to see the OneNote through there as well. Now, we also have a section we call private documents. This isn't part of the standard team site template, but it allows us to keep things like budgets and business development and quotes, things that we're not ready to share with the client in a library here, that when somebody comes in as a guest, we don't by default give them access to that. They only see what's in the shared documents here. So we're not making them part of a team. We're not making them part of the entire SharePoint site. We're setting up a structure that makes it easy to say, hey, if I put something in this structure here, a client's going to get to see it. If I put it in here, it's private just to Envision IT. So it becomes much easier for people. They understand that, hey, depending on where I save it, there's going to be a different behavior through there. Now, we also may use Planner. We don't use it on every project. We do use it on some. And we may use Stream from a recording of calls and things like that, just like we're doing here this afternoon. So that's sort of the structure. Let me flip over to what that looks like. So I've got my Teams open in a browser as well, because I'm using Teams to run the live event. So I needed a second session to run here. But this is our live Envision IT Teams. And you can see here, there's teams like consulting and development and HR and infrastructure management. I mean, those are standard sort of department level teams that you're going to find in virtually every organization. The ones that are different are things like this VRX Therapy or Teams Day Online. These are two not for our pro bono projects that we've worked on that we use from a demo point of view. So if I use VRX Therapy as an example, so this is a project we're doing with a good friend of mine who's in a wheelchair. He's suffering from some neuropathic pain, and we're trying to understand, can VR virtual reality help from a therapy point of view to deal with that phantom pain, something that affects amputees and spinal cord injuries quite commonly. So we've got a number of projects going on around that. We've got SharePoint Spaces, which is a Microsoft initiative to publish virtual reality into SharePoint Online. We've got the work around the website that we're launched for that. There's Extranet User Manager as part of that to let people join in through that. And we've got our general channel. So this kind of represents a client and the projects that we run for that. If we start at the general channel and we look across here, so we've got all our conversations happening through here, and we really encourage our staff to use channel conversations rather than one-on-one chat. It keeps those conversations searchable and available for anybody who's part of that team. So even if you weren't part of that conversation, you have visibility to it. And it's this concept of working out loud that we really like as part of that. If I come across to my Files tab, I can see folders that I've created in this general folder here. So I can interact with the files right through Teams, or I can say, you know what, I want to open this in SharePoint. It'll launch a new tab for me, and I can see those same documents through SharePoint. I can sync these down to my local file system, see them in Windows Explorer. So I can interact with these documents in lots of different ways, but they're all in the same place. There's this concept of single version of the truth. It doesn't matter whether I'm in Teams, Windows Explorer, or SharePoint, I'm working against the same documents through there. And I can go up a level here, and I can see the other channel folders, and there's some additional folders in here that aren't immediately obvious through Teams. We should probably do some reorganization and say, you know what, things like past invoices and quotes, we've got standard folders for, maybe we should tuck those under general so I can see them more easily when I'm in the Teams interface. And that's part of the information architecture planning that you need to do as an organization, and it's going to refine and adjust over time, just like we're seeing with ourselves. If we keep going across the tabs here, and I click on the OneNote, I mentioned before, I'm a huge fan of OneNote. It's really, really handy to keep all sorts of project notes and details and such in quick form here. It's co-author supported, so whether I'm in the browser or the app, multiple people can be working in here. I can open up this tab here and say, okay, what are the other sections that correspond to the channels that we've got over here and the pages that are in there? Or I could flip right over into the full OneNote for Windows 10 app. This is where I do most of my work in OneNote because it syncs, it's available offline, it's easy and quick to navigate around through here, and I can look at the different tabs and pages and things that I've got going on in here and see all those details. We're recording this session, we're going to be publishing it up as an event, but for internal meetings, we often record those as well, and we actually tag them in stream back to the channel that they correspond to, and we set up a tab in Teams so we can actually see those stream recordings. So if I want to go back in time, say, hey, I'd like to listen to that hour-long call that we had on a particular date, I can pop that open, and it's basically like a private YouTube. It actually does an auto transcript, so I can text search what was said through that and jump right to a particular spot in the conversation. And then lastly, we use Planner as well on some projects like this one here, so we can configure up buckets and have tasks and people assigned to it and due dates. We can see, charts and schedules and different analytics from there. So, all these tools are all part of Microsoft 365. They're not just Teams. It's about tying it together through Teams. So when we come back to templates, the ability to create a team and have all these tabs properly set up and ready to go, and the ability when a new project gets started to create a channel and set its tabs up appropriately through there, that's a big part of what we're talking about here. So enough on the Envision IT side. Let's come back to our deck here and keep going through there. So this, I'm going to skip over fairly quickly, but it basically reiterates what I just said there in terms of how we structure teams and channels and what goes into each of the elements within there. Now, I mentioned we often share externally. So we've got guest users, typically clients, that we want to bring into those SharePoint sites. We're not ready yet because some of the Teams limitations to bring them right into Teams, but we do want to bring them into SharePoint. That's pretty easy to do through the unstructured. I can say I just want to share this one document with the client through there. But we like to leverage Azure Active Directory B2B and actually make them part of groups and do some structured sharing through Extranet User Manager. So if I come back to the VRX Therapy site here and I look at it in SharePoint, if I go to the home on it, in addition to seeing the document activity, we see here a web part that's going to load up the groups for this particular site. And we'll actually see the people that are members of that group, and I can invite people in through there. So here's all the emails. I can say, hey, I want to add a new user in through there, invite somebody in, and go from there. Now, the key is that as a site owner, I get to decide who's coming into this site, but I shouldn't be making decisions around permissions. I shouldn't say, hey, I'm going to share this one particular deck with this one person. I'm bringing them into the client/project site altogether. And all the rules around should they see private documents and shared documents, those are already predetermined. When I add a person to the group, they get access to the appropriate things through there. And we can get private registration links that you can send out to people and approval processes to approve new users coming in through that. So you can get fairly sophisticated in terms of how you manage those users through that. So this just kind of reiterates that in terms of how we do the sharing, how we do the permissions, and this idea of separating permissions management from group membership is a really important one. Saying, okay, the business owner should absolutely decide who comes in, but they shouldn't start breaking inheritance and managing permissions in SharePoint. Things get messy that way and can get broken that way. All right, so let's come to the actual provisioning side. I took you through what the structure looks like. How do we build that structure out? So I'm going to use our open sources as the example for this part here. And what do we want that solution to do? Well, we want a self-service form so people can request a new team, a new site. Maybe we want approvals in there. We want it to be easily extensible because everybody's different and they've got different requirements in there. Make it easy to do that. Want to leverage out of the box like communication sites versus team sites, but also allow you to customize those site templates. And Microsoft's open source Patterns and Practices has done a lot of really good work around templating. We leverage a lot of that as part of there. We obviously want to support modern sites, Microsoft 365 groups, and Microsoft Teams as part of that. We didn't want to make this technically too complicated. I'm not going to get into the technical details in this session, but in the session the week after next, we're going to dive deep under the hood, kind of explain how that works. A lot of it's PowerShell. There's a little bit of SharePoint framework, but it's not a sort of a hardcore Visual Studio C# type of solution. We've tried to keep it something that IT pros can get their heads around and manage from that point of view. So there is some Azure Logic apps for doing workflows. We've got SharePoint, we've got some PowerShell, and that's really how that all wires together. It's all hosted up in the cloud, and so it's easy to provision and run from there. And when you create the team through that interface, again, it's going to build out all these components, but it can also template all of these out to say, hey, I want the OneNote set up a certain way. I want the planner set up. I want the SharePoint site up, tabs in the teams and things from that. So this is what the request form looks like. So let's actually go through that process. So I'm going to jump over to my other browser here. So I've got a couple of web parts on this page here. We've got our different forms of we call them the A to Z web parts that let me see sites and teams that already exist. So it makes it easy to navigate through that. This is the development environment that I'm in here right now. And this is the request one here. So this is basically the form people fill out to say, hey, I'd like a new team. So first off, we have this concept of division. Maybe we want to separate and organize things around, initiatives versus projects or clients, or however you want to categorize these requests. Those can be divisions through there. I'm actually going to use this temporary demos one. I'm not going to use the approval right now. I just wanted to go fairly quickly through from that point of view. So I can go ahead and pick a template. Now I could create a modern team site and have a team underneath that. It unfortunately takes a while for a team to get provisioned by Microsoft. So I'm going to take the quick path, which is to just do a communication site. Now, one of the things a lot of our clients asked was, let's have some standard prefixing and naming structure and blacklisted words and things like that. So this web part supports all that through there. So if I say, hey, I want to create Peter 26 as my dry run, you can tell I've done a bunch of dry runs in the last couple of days through here as I've been working on the solution. It auto creates the URL here. It checks to see if there's conflicts. It'll suggest corrections as part of that. I can put a purpose in here. I can decide, do I want to externally share this or not? I'm going to say, yeah, let's go ahead, but let's only share it with existing guests. When I do that, I'll still be able to use that Extranet User Manager Groups web part to add people in, but I won't be able to invite them through the native experience. So it kind of forces people down a certain path, which in some situations can be a really good thing. You can decide, hey, what are the default links in there? Do I want it to be people with existing access? How do I want to configure that out? What are the default permissions? Now, all of these choices here, you can predefine defaults. So you know what, don't even ask that. Maybe I just want to ask them for a name for the template, or sorry, a title, and go from there, and everything else is baked and ready. It's up to you how much control you want to give people through there. But I can go ahead and submit this. And what it's done is it's written it to a sites list in the background. Now, normally this all runs up in the cloud, but I'm going to do things a little differently here. I'm actually going to run locally so you can see what's happening. So this is the PowerShell that would normally be running up in Azure Automation. You wouldn't see it. You just see the results coming out from there. Well, let's go ahead and let that run. So it's going against that list. It's saying, hey, let's see if there's any new sites in there that I need to provision. It should come up in a second here to say, yep, there's that Peter test 26 that I just entered in there. So it's actually going to go through the process of creating it. It created it okay. There's no group associated with it. It's set the external sharing to existing external users only. Remember, I chose that option when I was requesting it, and it set the default link to be existing access. And the link permission to be view. Now, this part takes a little bit longer. This is applying a template, and it's basically inserting some metadata into the SharePoint site so that we can crawl it and make it available later. So we'll give that a minute to run through. We might have to come back to this once that's finished up. Oh, no, I think it's actually finished there. So it's applied the metadata to it. If there was a custom template, it would apply that. I've left it with the out-of-the-box template just to keep it quick to run through from there. So if I come back to my landing page here and I go ahead and refresh this, if I go to my E tab under temporary demos, because I chose temporary demos as my division here, this web part is scoped to that division. So it makes it very easy to see just those ones that I've created through the demo process. And we can see there's my Peter 26. It added an EXT prefix in because I said this was going to be externally shareable, and it added the demo prefix to indicate the division that I chose for that. I can just go ahead and control click on that. And there's my new communication site that's been created for me. If I had specific web parts and content and structure that I wanted in there, all that would get applied as part of the template. If I come into the site contents, this is the only thing that we've populated is the site metadata. It just tells some information around this particular site. Where does it sit in the breadcrumb hierarchy? What division does it belong to? What site template was it? And it actually gets used by the web parts for things like the My Sites. So this My Sites uses search crawl to find out which sites am I a member of and show those to me. It takes a little while for them to show up. Just before the webinar, I did Peter 25, so that's already gotten crawled by the Microsoft search and it's showing up in here. So probably in 10-15 minutes, if we came back here, we'd see the Peter 26 showing up in there. So it's a nice way for me to come in and say, hey, what are all the sites that I belong to? Let me navigate through those. Or, let me see the available ones, the ones that I'm allowed to see, but I'm not a member of, and maybe I can ask to be joined to those, or just combine those together and show me the combined list across all of that. So that's sort of the solution that you get out of the box today with our open source provisioning. But where have we gone with clients to go further than that? I'll skip past this part, all the documentational links. This will all be in the deck and available for you. Let's dive into some client scenarios, because this was really the topic for today, is how do we now integrate this in with your line of business systems. So I'm not going to name the clients that we've done these projects for. We do have case studies in flight for, I think, all three of them, or at least two of them. So we are going to be talking publicly about them. They're just not signed off and ready from that point of view. But I'll give you sort of the industry that they're in. And the first one is a technology consulting firm. So they're very much like Envision IT, that they provide consulting services for their clients. They run projects for those clients. They're bigger than us. They've got a lot more staff, so they've got a lot more clients and projects as part of that. But we base the solution off of our open source, but we wanted to use some integration into SalesForce. So as an organization, they use SalesForce as their CRM, and that's really the trigger for this system here. So we walk through a couple of workflow scenarios here. So I've included Dynamics as an example here too, but really we're just focused on the SalesForce example in this particular client scenario. So a new opportunity always starts in SalesForce. That's where it gets entered, it gets qualified, and it gets to a certain point that the sales team is going to start working on that. They need to start putting together proposals, statement of works, contracts, master service agreements, all that kind of stuff you need to do to land a new client. So Logic Apps is the workflow engine that runs up in Azure. And the nice thing about both Logic Apps and Power Automate is that they've got a ton of connectors to external systems. And even though Microsoft would love for you to use Microsoft Dynamics, they've got direct connectors into Salesforce and a whole bunch of other systems as part of that as well. There's literally hundreds, I think it's approaching 400 plus different systems that they integrate in with from that point of view. So we can have a trigger in our Logic app that says, hey, when a new opportunity with a certain qualification hits, that triggers this workflow. And these steps here are inside of that workflow. Basically, the workflow says, first off, do we already have a client team? So one thing this organization did was they kind of mirrored what we did and said, okay, we're going to have a team for every client, and we're going to have a channel for every project. So if there's already a client team, so this is an existing client, then we should probably just create a sales folder in that client's team site. But if they don't exist yet, we don't actually want to go to the effort of building a client team because they're not actually a client yet. There's still a prospect. So while they're in that prospect phase, we're just going to create a folder in the general sales team. And this is actually the same model we do at Envision IT as well. We don't create a team until the work is signed and we're actually moving forward with the client while they're in that pre-sales phase. If they're not an existing client, we just have a general folder with subfolders for each of those prospects that we're working on. So the sales team is either going to be working in one of those two spots. What we do is we update back into Salesforce to say, hey, here's the link to the new folder. It's either in this general or it's in the client team. But as a sales rep or a frontline person in the organization, they just look in Salesforce, there's a link to the documents, they jump over there, they're now in SharePoint Online, and where they go from there. And if they have conversations around that opportunity, those conversations would happen probably in the general channel for that client if it existed, or in the sales channel over in the sales team. Okay, so hopefully at some point that opportunity closes. So again, that's a trigger in Salesforce that triggers a second logic app workflow based on that activity happening in Salesforce. So we have to start with the same process to say, hey, is there a client team already there? If there is, then there was a opportunity folder there, but there wasn't a channel yet because we didn't have that project signed off. So we need to actually go into Teams and create a channel. We have to create a folder structure for all the project documents underneath that channel in SharePoint. And we have to take all those documents that we worked on in that pre-sales phase and move them into the project so they're there and available. So there's a nice handoff going from the sales team to the delivery team. Now, if this is a brand new client, this is the first project we're doing for them, we actually need to create the Office 365 group. We need to create the Microsoft team, which creates the SharePoint site. So we have to build all this structure up. But then we do the same thing. We create that same folder structure under the project channel. We take the sales documents that were in that general sales team and we move them into the client team under this project. So again, it keeps everything organized and it's not difficult for the staff. They're just marking things in Salesforce and magically under the hood, all these things are happening. And again, we're going to update CRM because there's now a new link for that folder. And there may be updates to other systems as part of this as well. You can decide how big of a process you want to automate through Logic Apps. It may be a good orchestration engine for doing a lot more within your organization. But the beauty is when either sales staff come in or delivery staff come in, all this structure is there and they just need to use it and follow it from there. It doesn't stop them from creating new folders or creating new channels if they want to. Odds are they're not going to, though. It's actually easier to follow the path that's been laid out for them than it is to break out and build their own path from there. So this is what we're talking about when we say, hey, let's integrate your ERP into your provisioning structure. Now, this is something we absolutely do as part of the open source solution. I've actually had a number of conversations with Michael at Orchestra around this. It is part of the Orchestra roadmap as well. It's not the next thing that they're working on, but it is an upcoming feature to say, hey, we'd love a custom connector, just like Salesforce has a custom connector into Logic Apps and Power Automate. Can Orchestra provide that same thing? Once you've got the API there in Orchestra, it's actually pretty easy to build the custom connector. So keen to see how that comes together to say, hey, we can use that whole provisioning engine, which, to be honest, is richer in Orchestra than it is in our open source solution, as part of this integrated solution here. I think you've got a pretty powerful solution from there. So let's take a second scenario here. This is an architectural firm, so still a consulting type of organization. Larger organization, again, north of 1,000 staff, bunch of offices across the country, and in their case, they have an ERP system, not Salesforce, so they want to trigger from this point of view. Now they've got a similar concept of channels representing projects through there, so it's still a similar sort of idea. But here now we've got their ERP solution that runs against SQL as an underlying database. The ERP didn't have those custom triggers that we could leverage off of. So we did some careful investigation with their team to say, okay, what's happening in the underlying SQL when things are happening here in ERP, and let's have some Logic App triggers off of that. It's not best practice. We would prefer to have open APIs from the ERP vendor to be able to do that. Because they may change their mind and start doing different things in the database, which breaks our workflow, so it makes it a little bit more brittle. But we're very clear that we never ever update things natively back into that SQL database. You never mess with another system's data, but you can build processes that look at that data. That's kind of the approach that we've taken here. And from there, that Logic App workflow then comes into Azure Automation, which is basically cloud-hosted PowerShell that then creates the team and the site. And brings those internal users in from there. So it's fairly similar to the previous scenario, just a slightly different trigger off from here. Now the third one, this is a financial services company. The challenge here This was an organization where they did have to have a lot of privacy. There was a lot of confidential financial data in their systems, and even within their organization, they're broken into teams, and those teams can't see what each other are working on. There's requirements both from a client privacy point of view and from a sort of an oversight point of view that they need to observe those boundaries. So this one actually took a fair bit more effort to say, okay, how are we going to structure that? What does a team represent and what does a channel represent? Now they're using, like us, Dynamics 365 as their structure, and they actually had a fairly deep hierarchy of entities. It wasn't just client and project like we saw in previous ones. There was sort of a nesting of about 4 levels of different entities in Dynamics 365 that we needed to represent. We've only got 2 things in Teams, the team and the channel, that we can capture that in. So what we did is we went deeper into the SharePoint structure and said, okay, let's build an information architecture in SharePoint that represents those additional entities. We use things like document sets that allows us to tag and apply metadata to that in a structured way. So the actual creation of a net new team was something that was manually triggered, and there was a couple of reasons for that. One was that when we launched this system, we didn't want to just create teams for everything in CRM, because that's too much. There's a change management and a migration process that needed to happen. So they kind of took it one by one through there, and they would just trigger that provision process for each one as they were ready to start that migration process. And even they've now completed all the core migration work, but there's still a need to create net new teams through there. They still wanted a manual step as part of that. And that's sort of the top of the entities in Dynamics 365. But as things happen deeper in that structure, we do have that automation in there, that the Logic App workflow triggers off that, and it builds out different things, either new channels or new document sets and folder structure inside of SharePoint, all as part of that process. So it keeps it very aligned. That the rich hierarchy of structure that you've got in Dynamics 365, we mirror that in Teams and SharePoint. And then all people need to do is make sure they drop documents in the right place, and it gets tagged, up that chain and organized properly from that point of view. And there was actually a big file share migration as part of this as well, because they were moving off of the file share world and into Teams and SharePoint. So we had an inventory process and a tagging process to say, okay, let's figure out where all these files are going to go in this new structure and manage that rich sort of document set metadata structure that we've got in SharePoint. We haven't done it yet, but there's a lot of discussions around, now that we've got that rich metadata, one of the goals was to do things like document compliance. If they've got required financial records that they need to have on file, can we harvest that information into Power BI and do some analysis on it? Like, is a particular document about to expire and we need a new one signed off? Are we missing certain documents that we're supposed to have? All that sort of thing can be done in that Power BI dashboard. And once you've got this rich information architecture in SharePoint, it actually becomes really easy to do that, to say, hey, I've got a file plan of what's supposed to be there from a records point of view and what's actually there, and we can compare and difference that and build some nice dashboards that makes it very obvious of where you are from a compliance point of view. So we see a lot of application of this, not just in the financial services, but anybody that's got a sort of strong records compliance structure that they want to bring into this Teams and SharePoint world. We're actually doing a future webinar on this topic around document compliance and how you collect them and such. So I'll touch on that in the end of the webinar. So we can see here, there's a manually created workflow that creates the team, but there's actually automated workflows that are happening from Dynamics 365 for those lower entities as well. And it's all running through and building that structure out in both Teams and SharePoint from there. Now, all 3 of these examples are strictly internal users right now. We've got a couple of projects under flight where external users are going to be coming in, typically into the SharePoint site, just like we do at Envision IT, and adding that piece in as part of that as well. So we've got a future webinar that's going to talk more around that topic. So just kind of high-level wrap-up points before we get on to sort of what's new and coming from here. So Microsoft 365 groups, this idea of not just a team, but a SharePoint site, OneNote, Planner, Stream. I mean, they're a great way to manage projects. If you think back to what I was showing you here when I was in Teams, I've got all these tabs and right within Teams, I've got access to my files, my jot notes in OneNote, my recordings of meetings, my planner tasks. It's all right here in one spot. It's a really great way to organize that. It actually frustrates me now when I get involved in a project that's heavily email dependent, because it's such a mess in your inbox where everything's kind of mixed all in together. Whereas Teams, I find, is very nice because you say, I want to focus on this particular project. I go to that channel in that team, and there's everything about that project, all the current conversations, all the current documents, everything I need to do from that point of view. So personally, I find it a much simpler way to stay organized, particularly because I often jump between a lot of different projects. I tend to get pulled in as a solution architect or just as a MVP consultant on a lot of the different client engagements that we have. And it's so much easier for me to say, okay, there's a consistent way and layout through here. So when I jump into this team, I'm not saying, how did the PM on this project decide to organize it, and where do I find things? There's a consistency there. And that's not just valuable for me as principal consultant, it's valuable for every member of the project team. If you think about long-lived projects, the majority of our projects run anywhere from several months into the years. People come and go on those projects. When somebody new joins the project, if everything was email focused, you've kind of lost all that history. They have to start with a blank slate, versus they join the team and all those conversations and documents and everything are there. They can start searching, they can read back, they've got all that historical context. Now, I know this is a lot to absorb, and you don't need to start with all of this. The client scenarios that I showed you there tended to focus on the teams from a conversations point of view and files in SharePoint document point of view. And we didn't get into Planner and Stream and OneNote so much on those ones, because change is difficult and you want to stage that out. You kind of bring those things in slowly over time and say, hey, let's get people used to this new way of communicating in Teams and managing their document in the Files tab or in SharePoint, and then add more things like OneNote or Stream recordings or Planner. You try and throw it all at people, you're just going to overwhelm them. So from a change management point of view, figure out what makes sense. Now, kind of on that change management theme, recognize that Microsoft 365 is changing quickly. So the ground is shifting underneath your feet, and you kind of need to be aware of that. You should have somebody in your organization that's kind of looking at the 365 roadmap and what are the new things that are coming out, because you have very little control. I mean, you can put yourself at the front or the back of the queue, but otherwise, as those changes get released by Microsoft, you're going to get them whether you want them or not. So you have to figure out, what's the impact of that change? How do I communicate that to my staff? How do I make sure they don't freak out because a button is now moved to somewhere different or something's different as part of that? So be prepared for that. Decide which conversation formats make sense for your teams. Little t, not big T. That's a fine distinction. You may choose to use Outlook and email. You may choose to use Yammer, which is another Microsoft product. Or Teams and channel conversations. I'm obviously a fan of the Teams channel conversation side of things. We've driven our internal email almost to zero at Envision IT. Almost everything happens through Teams. I really like that approach. It's working really well for us. It is a change. It takes a while for people to get used to it, but as you start leveraging it more and more, you realize the value of it. Put your governance plan in place. Whether that means, hey, we're just going to leave it wide open with some guidance, or we're going to lock it down and have people fill out service tickets and tightly control it, or we're going to put something like Orchestra or your open source solution in front of that. That's only part of the governance plan. It's also, what are your suggested ways of working? What training are you doing? What are you doing from a change management point of view? All that needs to be part of your governance plan. What's your external user policy? Are you never, ever going to bring people in from outside, or maybe not today, but you want to plan for the future? Well, you should figure out your information architecture to support that. And on the information architecture point, we used to be very focused on SharePoint when we were building information architecture. We actually do what we call a Teams first IA now, where we start with Teams and really figure out what a team and a channel represents. And then that partially defines what the SharePoint information architecture is underneath that. And then we flush that out deeper, like that one example using Dynamics 365, where they had a deep structure of entities in CRM. That became a part of the model for the SharePoint information architecture. Ideally, I'd encourage you to build some sort of provisioning process, whether you do it yourself, use open source, purchase a commercial product, doesn't matter. People people want the ability to do this, and having some structured process around it is going to help your organization hugely. And lastly, as we've talked about here today, think about integrating that with your ERP, your CRM. What does your business process look like? What are your line of business systems, and how do we integrate it in as part of that? This is part 1 of 2 session. So I consciously stayed away from the technical bits for the most part in here. I'm going to take the opposite approach in the session the week after next, where we're going to dive very deep down into the underworkings of this. So going into what the solution is, how the Logic App is built, the PowerShell and the Azure automation, that whole side of it. There is a new release that I'm working on that I haven't released out, which will be going out prior to that webinar. Some of the key things, if you've been aware of or used our solution in the past, it's been refreshed to use the latest version of PnP PowerShell. So that open source project from Microsoft has gone through a big evolution in the last couple of months or so. They're moving off of a bunch of legacy stuff onto newer .NET versions. So this is using that. From a security point of view, we're using service principals, which are the preferred way of securing. You get improved security. There's no need for user accounts with multi-factor authentication turned off. So that's a big boon for your security officer. We're making it a lot easier to deploy. So we've got an ARM template that deploys all the elements out, so you don't have to manually go through a whole bunch of steps to do that. And we've actually simplified the architecture. We had an API that was deployed out previously that did things like handle the requests and make sure that the security was there. We've since figured out how to do that better through Logic Apps and actually make the solution a lot simpler. So we've eliminated the API. The web part just posts directly to the Logic App for the workflow. Things like the hidden sites that we're managing through the API, we just do that through native item level permissions. And I like a simpler solution. It's often actually more elegant, and it's definitely less brittle and easier to maintain from that point of view. So that's what's coming down the pipe. Some other topics unrelated. I'm also doing a series in March on forms and workflows. So it's going to be structured similar to this one here, where the first session on March 9th is very much business scenarios and kind of taking you through the options of, do I use Microsoft Forms? Do I use Power Apps? What about my InfoPath forms? Do I hand build HTML forms? Do I use a commercial product? Like, there's a number of options as to how you build forms. And I'll kind of go through those from a business perspective. The second in the series is actually going deeper into a leave request process that we've built internally at Envision IT. We've delivered similar solutions for clients. This one's actually a quite simple one. So it uses a Microsoft form. If you're not familiar with it, it's how we built that survey form for this session here. It's super simple to build a form in. It only applies to certain scenarios. So if you've got a, hey, just fill it out and you never need to come back to the form again type of form, which leave request we decided could be done that way, Forms works well for that. If you've got something bigger like an expense form where there's lots of calculations and expanding tables and different approval steps where people need to sign off through there, you probably need something more than that. And for that third part of the webinar, we're going to go into how we built an HTML form, but we still use out of the box low code, no code solutions like Logic Apps and SharePoint as part of that solution. So I encourage you to check those out if you're interested. Actually been really busy putting topics together for the winter and the spring. I've got another one on secure development coming up and software development lifecycle. How do you take all this stuff that I'm talking about here and make it easy to deploy in different environments and work well from a enterprise deployment point of view. And then the last pair, they're actually unrelated. One is around that compliance topic that I was talking about. How do we collect documents, particularly from external users, and do things like Power BI dashboard of compliance and such around that. And then the other one, also on the Power BI theme, is I mentioned Planner. There's not a lot of support for seeing a big view across multiple plans. The Planner Hub, gives fairly limited visibility there. So we've actually built a harvester that harvests that data. We can bring it into a Power BI dashboard. We can have different portfolios of plans and different security around those. So a nice solution that we're going to be presenting on that side. And actually a customer case study that we'll be announcing as part of that one as well. So that's it from there. I've been banging through here. I actually haven't had a look at the Q&A to see if there's open questions from that point of view. So there was a question about blacklisted words. So when you're on the site request, so when I'm over here, and say I want to create a particular named communication site, there's a list that we keep behind here of words that you're not allowed to use in there. You know, for example, you shouldn't be able to create a team called human resources. If HR hasn't created that team yet, they probably want to have ownership of it. They don't want just some random employee to own that HR team. And you can kind of apply that to any of the department level. There may be inappropriate words, other things that you want to blacklist out from that point of view. A question on Microsoft Viva. Actually, Eric, do you want to take this one? Because you've dug deeper into that side of things. I haven't had a chance to catch up on the webinars on that topic. Oh, actually, I don't know if the live works because of the delay there. Oh, there we go. Hey, Eric.
Hey, everybody. I am here. I'm very prepared to have this quick conversation with you. So Viva is essentially the opportunity to bring intranet and a greater employee experience into Teams itself. So for those who may be looking at Teams today, it's something that's very much based on the Teams and project conversation. This is one that allows your employees, consultants, contractors, and whatnot, the ability to come into the Teams environment and have a greater cultural experience, a greater communicative experience, and just work better overall together.
So it's really a complement to what we're talking about here today, right? Like it doesn't replace anything here. It provides much richer feedback and analytics on how you're interacting with your organization and what's going on around you from a wellness point of view.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Eric.
Sure.
So I think that's it for questions. Look at that, 3 minutes to the top of the hour. Timing actually worked out okay on a new topic there. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining. The recorded session is live available, so that link you came in to join the meeting, you can actually use to come in to view the recording as well. Encourage you to have a look at that. And by all means, if you haven't already, sign up for part 2 of the webinar, and we'll see you the week after next. Thanks, everybody.